is The Sean Thompson Show.
This looks like a job for me, so everybody just follow me, 'cause we need a little controversy.
When I saw that I was going to be interviewing my next guest, who I know I've talked to, I think I've talked to you once before, I immediately thought of this clip.
I say to people who say we have to have government medicine in there, and I say, would you mind first telling me which of the other great reforms of government have achieved their objectives? I take it you mean the federal housing program has solved the problem of housing for the low-income groups? I take it you mean that the federal welfare program has solved the problems of welfare and indigence and dependence? Well, the people, after all, are catching up. So I think it is not entirely hopeless that we can stop this march and turn it back. Thank you.
Did the Sherman Antitrust Act break up monopolies, or did it create the biggest monopoly, the government? I think it's the latter. My next guest was formerly the chief economist for the U.S. Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs. He's a senior research faculty member at the American Institute for Economic Research. Now his name is Dr. Thomas Hogan. How are you, Thomas?
I'm great, thanks. Glad to be on.
You know, when I saw what happened with FTX, first of all, I am a proponent of cryptocurrency because I realized the bastardization of the American dollar, the corruption therein, that we are so unmoored from any principles. And any government that's in power, no matter if I agree with them or not, can simply create more debt and use it as a weapon of taxation against the citizens. So I am not a fan of a bastardized principle of currency. So when I saw, Bitcoin and the rest of it, it made sense to me. I loved it. But then you saw some scallywags come along. They created stuff out of thin air. And then there was one in particular who launched 90 days after Joe Biden announced he was going to run. And it was a flash in the pan, but it took a lot of people down what they called FTX. And in some cases, this kind of collapse can be used by the government to get a leash, a collar around something it normally couldn't. Do you think that's might be what's happening here?
Yeah, absolutely. So FTX was one of the largest cryptocurrency exchanges, and it failed, and people are calling for the regulation now of the cryptocurrency industry. But it's funny because people within the crypto industry, they don't see this as a failure of crypto. FTX was a regular financial company that just happened to be operating in crypto. They see this as a failure of traditional finance and a failure of government regulation. They see crypto as the solution to that will provide more transparency and safety for financial innovation.
But they're relying on the economic ignorance that would allow people to vote for those people telling the fairy tale of utopia, pretending it's a philosophy, and ignoring the failure that has led to a $31 trillion debt and $1 trillion in interest payment, and nobody knows who gets the money. So there's something there to banking on the stupidity of the American. You could go far, and before you know it, the SEC could get stronger from its greatest failure.
Yeah, so I think most people believe that there's going to be more regulation and that's going to make everyone safer. And they don't understand that regulation, especially in the finance area, really causes companies to take more risk rather than less. And so this is a huge problem. I think, a complicated financial regulation system is just like a complicated tax code. People can get around it. Banks can get around those regulations. But even worse, the regulators don't know what products are risky and what products are safe. Like in the early 2000s, they were telling all the banks, load up on mortgage-backed securities. Those things are super safe. But they ended up being the main cause of the 2008 financial crisis. And so the regulators don't know what's going on and are probably likely to make things worse rather than make them better.
But you know this because you saw the inner workings, the ugly sausage of government. And 90% of Americans, 90% of people, when they hear the word government, their brain short circuits, and they don't realize this is only made up of actual people, flawed, pliable, buyable, and that's why there is no such thing as government. There's just people with a lot of arbitrary power. And they don't realize that both Bernie Madoff, all the way down to the original Ponzi, all had their favorite government whores that they bought and sold. Madoff was under investigation for 20 years. He just kept buying who investigated him. FTX, this kid's parents, his aunt, all interwoven in government oligarchy, and all with the saving approval of our own SEC, our CFTC, and all the rest of the organizations that are supposed to never allow something like this to happen. And if it does, they certainly aren't going to allow hedge funds to invest pension money in it. But yet all of that happened, didn't it?
Yeah, and this was a failure, not of a mistaken pick of risky assets or something like that. This was a fraud. I mean, at least is what it appears to be, right? He stole billions of dollars from American citizens and shipped them to his hedge fund and lost all that money. And you'd think anyone that did that would be in jail already, but Sam Bankman-Fried that ran FTX and was the main owner. He was the biggest donor to the Democratic Party in the midterms, one of the biggest donors to Joe Biden's presidential campaign, and somehow has not been arrested yet. So
now Tom, I've read your resume.
Unusual.
I read your resume. I recognize how brilliant you are, and I recognize your own career, but you're talking to somebody from Chicago. So when you talk about too big to get arrested, you got to remember we invented that. We've got aldermen who are legit mafia bosses. Their kids live like mafia bosses. They never do a day in jail. And in fact, they go retire, ironically, to better states on government pensions that we're taxed for. So we need to break this chain. And as we go down this yellow brick road, I love that movie, The Wizard of Oz, but we kind of know where it leads. And is there a way to stop this? Is there a way to talk truth to power and say FTX isn't an example of why your government should be involved? It's an example of why your government should be sitting in the corner and shut its mouth until the American people tell it to act.
Yeah, so one of the big problems is that these regulatory agencies that are making the rules here, they're basically unaccountable. They're appointed and then independent to make up all these rules, and so they can use whatever political means that they want, and they can pressure the companies to do the things that they want. And most of these rules, they don't do any cost-benefit analysis or calculations to make sure that this is good for the American people. They just do whatever they think is a good idea at the time. And so that's something that we don't want happening to the crypto industry. Like you were saying, crypto is something that is right now basically outside of government, where they're trying to make it safe. The industry is trying to protect itself and offer a product that is good and safe and transparent, and regulation is likely to ruin that.
I'm reading when you sat as the chief economist for the U.S. Senate Committee on Banking. Do people not remember how many more opportunities, many more private held banks there were before Dodd-Frank, and how the economic collapse of 2008 was not only perpetrated decades before, but capitalized on by bills that politicians don't read. In fact, that bill was arguably written by Citibank or Bank of America or some other new oligarch that could not have existed before the Dodd-Frank bill. And are there enough people with enough courage and intellect to want to change the system of failure leading to government supremacy?
Yeah, I think definitely a lot of the regulations in the Dodd-Frank Act were just served as barriers that prevented small banks from coming in and competing, small businesses from coming in and competing. And that's something that, like the big banks, they have teams full of lawyers that they pay millions of dollars already to protect themselves or get around these regulations. But small businesses can't do that. It's impossible for them to be able to compete with that kind of advantage. And so that's why you're right. We saw, before 2008, we had almost 150 new banks every year. After Dodd-Frank Act, basically zero. I think there was one new bank created in the, 8 years or something after Dodd-Frank. And so it really did prevent new banks from coming in and competing because the big companies had captured that regulatory apparatus.
But it also created far more lobbying money from fewer oligarchs. And you're a capitalist, and I know you are. And I know this must aggravate you and drive you insane that this country is devolving into a top-down collectivist government on top of everything, in control of everything. And ultimately, I think capitalism will win. But I am losing my hair, and I don't want to look like Telly Savalas. And I enjoyed the idea that I could provide not just a nice life for me and my kids, but maybe through the property rights that made us the youngest and the richest country, kind of a legacy where I could guarantee none of my descendants in the future would be slaves. Yet when you look at the economic system, where do you think it leads?
Yeah, I think it's a problem that these big regulatory agencies, they're basically unaccountable. And once Congress creates them, the regulatory agency is just going to make all these rules that restrict American businesses, restrict people from doing what they want to. And like you said, that destroys the economy. That prevents innovation. It prevents competition. And so these agencies, they're like another branch of government that was never intended by the Constitution. And they, shouldn't be allowed to do that. We need some accountability, and we need some ability to prevent them from pushing these costs onto Americans, from stifling competition. But there's no way to do that right now. So it's a pretty bad situation for the capitalist economy.
Every day is my Super Bowl. I don't watch sports, but what I do is focus on policies. So every day I'm listening to the news, and every day I'm getting more and more aggravated and irritated. And I keep hoping that my fellow Americans will realize there is not one that I can think of government policy that operates and works the way it is sold to the people. And regardless of the administration, the only thing that's consistent is the massive amounts of government spending, the massive amounts of government profiteering as their bureaucracies just grow mindlessly with these red line base increases. And is there ultimately enough people to wake up to that as they see the best job to have now isn't a small business owner or an entrepreneur or a guy with a patent? Best job they have is some bureaucrat like Fauci, who's a god among men.
Yeah, it's pretty scary. One of the bad things that's happening right now, like you said about spending and also the Federal Reserve, is we're having all this inflation. And you'd think, polls going into the recent election were showing inflation as being like the number one issue for voters. And so you'd think that would cause some kind of reforms that would get the Fed under control. But frankly, I don't know if that's going to happen. And the same thing is true of spending. Everyone agrees that it's a problem, but it's pretty difficult to try to reform that. So I don't know. I hope it'll happen. But
yeah. See, I have more faith in my fellow Americans because I'll use my mother as an example. Her entire life, she was a constant conservative constitutionalist. It wasn't until 12 years ago when she died she became a Democrat. So we've got ballot harvesting and voter fraud here in Chicago, Illinois, and that's why I think they stay in power. But as you worked in the inner workings of government, and you would talk to the men and women who were elected, the hopes, and they had their side parts and their $3,000 suits on, and they looked like used car salesmen. When you would talk to them and you'd get into the specifics and the beauty of philosophy and propertyism that's called capitalism and Americanism, did you see a glazed look on their face like Joe Biden has with the dementia stare, or did you see hope in their eyes?
There are definitely some people in politics that I think are good people and trying to do the right thing, and others that aren't so much. So it's hard. But even the people that want to do something good, they're stuck in a system where all that the government can do is take money away from some people and give it to other people, and it's hard to create any value. It's hard to create good things for society because of the system that we have right now. It makes it difficult.
And I'm reminded of Stalin's diary, which was named "Good People Trying to Do Good Things." In the meantime, Dr. Thomas Hogan, I like the idea that there are people like you that are influential and are put in positions where they can maybe talk some intellect to some people who are more interested in wearing $6,000 suits and retiring worth $500 million from insider trading. Next, we'll get into your trading portfolio and see if you're half the trader Paul Pelosi is. But in the meantime, keep it up at the research faculty member at the American Institute for Economic Research. Dr. Thomas Hogan, thank you for joining me.